Welcome to your podcast, Leadership is Tricky, where we'll tackle various topics, challenges, and experiences as it relates to your investment in leadership. So, let's design success together. Now your hosts.
Hey everyone, Eric here with Leadership is Tricky, and we are back. So our return listeners, thank you for sticking with us. We have a great guest today. I've been waiting several years for this one, so I'm excited. How you doing, sir?
Eric, I'm doing well, and I appreciate you having me on. I'm a big fan of yours and your podcast.
I appreciate that. So we have Major General retired now, so I'm gonna put a retired quotes on it. And Pete Andrysiak, and again, I've been waiting several years for this podcast because I'm intrigued by his story. He's had a profound impact on my career and my kind of drive as a professional, having to work with him through one of the more chaotic moments in history. And he allowed me the opportunity to work alongside him and kind of work through things. So, but we'll get into that here shortly. So I think we just dive right into it. General Andrysiak, I know that you just retired several weeks ago, and I just got to ask up front, what'd you do that next morning after you retired?
Well, I don't think life is any different just yet because I still got, I'm still on the books. So, right, so I'm still getting a paycheck. I'm more focused on, those personal things that you got to knock out before, you finally drop from the rolls and make sure everything is straight. And then, in the process of moving, because we're going to stay local for at least a year here. Long before that, Eric, you start the thought process of how life's going to be different.
Right.
It's 40 years ago that I started all this. First time I put on a uniform when I went to the prep school for West Point. So, you start to mold that over months in advance of the actual retirement ceremony. Wondering, how life is going to be, once you take the uniform off, and that's one of the big challenges, right? Is struggling with that piece. That's a real issue that. I've talked to many folks about. So that's where I am right now, trying to find myself on my way out here.
Well, as you find yourself, make sure you take some notes and maybe we could pass on some lessons learned to those that come behind you, right? And it's crazy when you say 40 years. Let's see, I was 4 years old when you first donned on that uniform, but our paths have intersected. You've been places where I grew up in my career, and but we're going to capture all that here shortly. But yeah, so here we are in season 5, and for those that are listening and have been part of the podcast, we kind of switch things up, and we're capturing stories so people can see themselves in the experiences of others. And sir, you're no different. So we're gonna start back at young Pete, but I think we're gonna go even before that, before young Pete was a thing, right? Because your story kind of starts mid-century, mid 20th century, with your grandfather and the things that he went through, and then your father, and then we'll step through that. But tell us a little bit about your family history.
Eric, I appreciate that. This is one of these things that I didn't really start sharing until the last year, be quite honest with you. And people wished I would have shared it earlier. So my dad was actually born here in Germany in Bremerhaven. So, and my mom was actually born in Czechoslovakia. And it wasn't until a little bit later that they came together. So my parents, both kids in World War II. And as you described, my father's dad was picked up by the Nazis in 1939, sent to Sachsenhausen, and then would eventually go to the concentration camp in Austria. It's called Mauthausen, and he lasted there a couple of weeks. I recently got to go speak at their 80th anniversary, so it was pretty neat to be able to be there at a place where he died at that point. But at the same time, my mom's living in Czechoslovakia in the Sudetenland, and the Nazis come in and invade. Eventually, when the war ends, the Russians kick them out of the Sudetenland because she was a German-speaking Czech. They weren't welcome there either, right? And so they were pushed west over into Germany. My dad left in 1953. He was 16 years old by himself to go live with his stepsister in Coos Bay, Oregon. So he got on a boat in Bremerhaven, sailed across the Atlantic. I don't know how he made it from Ellis Island up into Coos Bay, Oregon, but that's where he went at 16 years old. I can't imagine. My son just turned 18, making that journey on your own so young. What Started to go to high school, didn't speak a lick of English. His principal was the guy that taught him English, but he never finished. My dad wound up enlisting in the Army before he even finished high school. And his first assignment brought him back to Stuttgart, Germany. He was an MP. He was a young sergeant working at the gate of Kelly Barracks. My mom's mom, and they lived over by Degeloch, over by Kelly Barracks. My mom's mom was cleaning quarters on Kelly Barracks for officers. And one day she came to find her mom, bumped into my dad at the front gate, and that's where they met. Um, and then shortly thereafter, they were married, and my two sisters were born on that first tour. So that's really that story right there. And my mom encouraged my dad to go to OCS. He eventually became an infantryman, spent 20 years in the military, got out and became a DA civilian, and did over 20 years as a DA civilian. Eventually, that brought us back to Germany a couple of times. I lived in Ramstein once before, but I went to high school my last 3 years in Heidelberg. That was 40 years ago that I left Heidelberg to really start this journey. So it's a pretty remarkable story. The hardships that my parents endured, one of many, families that have gone through something like that. But clearly, that upbringing, the example they set was really what was the example, right? The American dream. They lived it. Um, and I'm so grateful for the Army and the opportunities that it provided my family. That my dad's example really is what drove me to serve. So that's the short history, Eric.
Yeah, for those that want to just read more about that, the first time I heard it, it was during one of the speeches that you gave, and then I saw it was posted on YouTube, in fact. And I was just listening to your story, and I had no idea about any of that, when we first met, because I probably would have picked your brain all about it because I was just fascinated by that. But I think that the key piece, though, is a lot of their hardships and their hard work and just really, fighting the odds and adversity, and continuing to serve through all of that, got you to where you were, which was, leaving Heidelberg, Germany, which if you haven't been, it's one of the most beautiful places in the entire world. But that's where I started my military career, was in Heidelberg. So our paths did cross at Campbell Barracks, maybe a few years prior to that. But your history was there, so you allowed me to stand on your shoulders, and start my military career there as well. But so you leave Heidelberg, Germany, and then what?
Yeah, so I was going to go to the University of Arizona, and I was going to go ROTC there. I got an invite to walk on and play football. Um, then at the last minute, West Point called me and said, "Do you want to come play football at West Point?" I didn't even think that was even possible. So I said, "Hey, sure." He's like, "Well, if you're going to do it, you've missed the application deadlines for West Point. You have to go to the prep school." And then that prep school was at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. So I signed up for it. Of course, my parents were ecstatic. They've been saving up money for college. Right? That's a little bit of
Right.
money they get to keep in their pocket. And so that's where I started. I went to, showed up at Fort Dix in the summer of '85, went through your mini little boot camp, and then started at the prep school. And I was still questioning it. My dad always gave me outs and opportunities. He's like, "Hey, you can always go back and live with your sister in Arizona, no pressure." And I struggled. I didn't know that I was going to really make my way through this thing, but we took a trip up in the fall to go to West Point to spend a week there with cadets, get to see the academy. It's the first time I've ever seen it, and got to watch a football game. And that trip alone, right, and the impression it left on me, I was like, I'm all in, and everything changed for me in terms of my focus, right, and what I was willing to do to get in there. And so that's really where it started. So I spent a year at the prep school, and then got accepted to go to West Point, and then spent the next 4 years going to West Point, getting a degree in civil engineering, and I played football at the same time as well.
All right. So for those that don't know about Pete Andrysiak, so he's about 7 foot tall. I mean, I'm 5'7". He just seems like a giant next to me, right? But yeah. So what position do you play?
So I was a recruited tight end, Eric, and coach looked at me like the first day of practice, says, "Hey, we don't throw the ball, so you're not going to be on the O line." And so I wound up as an offensive guard. And
Right.
that's where I played for the 4 years.
Yeah. So why civil engineering?
My dad was an infantryman, and what he told me was, "Hey, whatever you do, don't be an infantryman." Right. And he said, because the only two things you can do when you get out of the army is you can be, a hitman for the mafia or a mailman, right? Because there's the only two skills that you walk away with.
Right.
Uh, so that wasn't the only reason. I actually, my first choice of branch was aviation. But I wanted to study engineering, so I knew that math is an area that I really enjoyed. And I think early on, my father just really introduced me to engineering, and that was really the impetus for it all. And then once I got into it, those were the classes that I think I excelled most at school, and I enjoyed it. And so, where there's passion, right, it becomes less painful to work your way through that.
Right.
But plenty of folks told me along the way, you can't do, all those things. You're not gonna be able to graduate, get a degree in engineering, and play football. And so it was a lot of work, but obviously worthwhile. But yeah, I had an early passion for engineering, and like I said before, my initial branch was aviation. I was medically disqualified, but my second choice was the branch engineers. And in hindsight, I'm glad I did, because I've loved what I've been able to do as an engineer officer in the Army.
I would have loved to see you kind of squeeze into a F-16 cockpit. You'd have your knees up here by your chin, right?
That's right, little tight spaces.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, so all right, so you walk out of West Point, right? So you've had several years playing football, your bright mind, you get your engineering degree. So what was young Lieutenant Andrysiak like?
Man, Eric, I think I'm like most lieutenants, right? Yeah, you have a foundation that they give you academically, right, where they teach you a lot of stuff in a classroom. You get an opportunity to go out and do some practical application. But like most, you got to be able to be brought in by great NCOs, right, and really taught the ropes, right? And right, so I think I had the willingness and desire to want to serve. And so I was like, I think like most lieutenants, I was very curious. I was committed. I didn't want to fail. Eric, that's what I wanted to make my parents proud. But I also didn't know how long I would serve. And I tell folks that it was really one job at a time. I knew that first gate I had to hit was my 5-year commitment.
Hmm.
I could walk away then, but I knew I wanted to at least have the assignment that's just really after 5 years as being a company commander. So that was my initial goal, be a company commander. So I was like any other lieutenant, right? Green, wanting to learn, eager, and I think I just came in with the right attitude, and I was pretty motivated.
Yeah, because I've been around the military. I think I just hit 25 years in October. Just of military service, and most lieutenants that I run into, right? They're bright-eyed, they're curious. They have a passion to want to jump into the activity of leadership. But you hit it on the head. Most lieutenants, it's usually the NCO that kind of pulls them under the wing and says, "Hey, this is doctrine. This is how the Army works." And so, do you have any, recollection of anyone that kind of like took you under their wing and said, "Hey, I'm going to be your mentor, get you through this tough time of because you're on the fence at that point. You're not really sure, is this something I want to do forever? Is there any recollection of any early on mentors or any leadership experience that you had as a lieutenant that kind of shaped you?"
Yeah, so I think the my second platoon sergeant was a guy named Gary Williams. And he was the guy that brought me in and showed me the ropes, and he invested in me. I would say that he poured as much as he could into me, um, gave me all the tools that I needed to be able to do to think for myself. And there were plenty of opportunities where you would sit around a room where you got to make a decision. They would tee up the facts, turn it over to me, and it's what you want, because there's always I would, when as a battalion commander, I would tell a lot of lieutenants, hey, don't fall into the gunny highway syndrome. Think about Heartbreak Ridge and Clint Eastwood, where they tell the lieutenant, hey, go stay in the office. When we go to the fields, you can come out.
Right.
That's not how he was. He taught me everything from an administrative standpoint, right, in a tactical standpoint, and he really inspired me, taught me what it is that I needed to know to think for myself. And then when it came time to decide, it's like, all right, sir, that's up to you. So he was really the first one. And at the time, uh, you know, company XOs were pretty impressionable at that point in time. in terms of the amount of influence that they would have over lieutenants in their company. And it was a friend of mine named Adam Suk. He was the first lieutenant, company XO is another great guy that, you think of first lieutenant, mentoring second lieutenants, he did it and he did it really well. And, I think those are, I struggled to see a lot of that. I think a lot of lieutenants just become friends, right? And first lieutenants don't think they have anything to share with second lieutenants. And the reality is that they spend a couple years as a platoon leader, they got plenty of things to share, and help you be better, because I think that's the most important piece.
Yeah, so you said two great things that I loved, right? One is he was willing to pour into you, right? And that activity of leadership, it's all about that. It's like giving back and just pouring what you can into those whose cups are empty, right? Whether it's experience, knowledge, energy, whatever it is. And the other one was, which I really want to pull the trigger on because you talked about you wanted to be a company commander, is you didn't want to fail, right? And I think that's usually when you're dealing with someone that's new and green in the activity of leadership is they don't want to fail, right? And you got to give them space to fail. So you go into company command, right? And I'm pretty sure that you had a lot of experience, and yeah, everyone fails, right? As we're leading, talk to me about company command and how you were able to pour back into others, and where did you fail?
Yeah, so that's I'll have to think about the failure piece of it. When I say fail, Eric, I think the biggest thing is, my dad is a Vietnam veteran, right? And would share um, some pretty deep stories, like this idea, right? We're making a mistake and losing someone in combat.
Mhm.
I think that's one of the things that I really would fear the most. And so as a company commander, there was a couple people that invested in me, Eric, but I would tell you that most of my career, there was I think a big void that I would describe where people didn't really sit down and, invest as much time as they could have. So I've had, great leaders that did that. I made it a point, right, to invest in my lieutenants and my platoon sergeants as much as I could as a company commander. So frequently I would have leader development sessions, with them. We do train walks. We would go on staff rides. It's not often that company commanders take, their leadership on a staff ride somewhere to an old battlefield to really understand, historical battles, how they were fought, decisions that were made. Those were the things. I've always felt that the thing that I valued most, right, was my investment in people,
Mhm.
right? Because I knew that I had a role and responsibility in the Army as a profession to develop them and make sure that they were successful, right? Because there were a couple of them that did it for me. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't one of those guys on the outside that said he's in it for himself. And so I spent an inordinate amount of time doing that, and it was a focus throughout my career. As a company commander, I have to think about one of those examples, where I failed. To be quite honest with you.
It's okay. I'm not gonna let you off the hook, so we'll get back to it, right?
I got I
Eh,
got one that I'll share as a battalion commander. That's a little bit more emotional, but I'll be willing to share that. Absolutely.
all right, absolutely. Yeah, so one of the things you just talked about though is like investing and pouring into others, right? And I saw that firsthand. And what I'm really going to highlight the moment where you've really impacted me, and we'll get to that here shortly. But pouring back into others, and you made that a priority, which was people, right? And exercising that activity of leadership, and that was one of the reasons I started this podcast because leadership is in fact tricky, right? Finding that balance of how do you pour into others, sometimes when your cup is empty, how do you champion or advocate for others? Was there someone early on in your career that, really grabbed you and said, "Hey, let me help coach or advocate for you"? Because, once you leave company command and you start looking at battalion command or staff positions that we'll get into here shortly, is, do you have a one or two people that, really like grabbed you and said, "Hey, look, I see potential in you. I see what you're doing," and they advocated for you or they coached you to get to the next step?
Yeah, I would tell you I would say when I was a major and I went to Iraq for the first time, I was an outsider. I deployed a little bit late coming into First Brigade, First Cavalry Division. The brigade commander is a guy named Abe Abrams. right? So, he's the youngest son of Creighton Abrams. He was the brigade commander, quite a personality.
I just met him.
Um, did you?
I did. I met him in
Yeah.
October because our AUSA chapter is named after his father. So we met him in DC.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. Yeah, so Eric, I came in and I realized that all my peers were really hand selected to be in the brigade, and I was the one outsider. And I thought to myself, man, this is where it's going to end. Right? I'm the guy at the bottom of the list that got pushed in here because my timeline, I needed to get this job in. But I'll tell you is that as I went through everything, like what I learned is, as a leader, phenomenal combat leader, right? In terms of he was clearly in charge. He had phenomenal systems that were in place. Um, but he was demanding, right? His
Mhm.
expectation was, and he always described this as majors. Once you become a major, right, is that you got to do things right and you got to do it right the first time, and he expects you to be able to have a mastery of the details as well. And then he was also big on you got to get along with your peers, and if you didn't get along with your peers, that was not the kind of person that you wanted in the organization. And so every time I got plenty of times to, he gave me clearly a fair shake and took care of me. And in the end, but every time I sat down with them, where I was the domain expert in my particular space, I would bring it to him, and usually he had the read ahead. He understood what it was, and man, he could quickly master the details, and then start asking questions that I couldn't answer. And it wasn't sharpshooting questions where some people try to do that to you, right, to prove to you that they're superior. That was not the case because this was all about business. And so the things I learned about was his example in combat leadership, the way he interacted with staff, the details that he got into. But I also got to see a different side of him when he started taking casualties, right? Very passionate about what he did. And I left that job, and I would say it was that job that I worked for him in that deployment really set the stage for how I approached my jobs that would follow and how I would command and lead in the future. And he spent time, right, coaching and developing. And it was I would describe it as any time that you were in front of him, any day, it was a lesson in leadership, and you needed to be taking notes. And I think a lot of guys don't pick up those cues, and miss out on those opportunities. For me, I was just like, this is all free. I'll take all this stuff down. And that was really the first one. And then I maintained contact with him throughout my career, and he would always look out after me. Got me jobs later in life. But yeah, like, to me, an exceptional leader. I enjoyed working for him.
That explains a lot because in my interactions with you, mastery of the details was big for you. But again, we'll get to that here. We'll get to that here soon, right? Um, so you spent time. So you get through your brigade command, and eventually you make general, right? You make GO. So tell me about that transition for you as a leader and your mindset. Um, right? Because they typically get one stars right. No, they typically do, right? But when you look at O6s, just across the board, right? They're all great in their own right. But there's always the ones that kind of separate themselves. And then I know that the mindset changes, from a leader perspective, because you go from being a tactical person to now strategic agility and intellectual horsepower really come to play, right? Because you're responsible for a lot. So talk to me through, that mindset and how it switches when you become a GO.
Yeah, Eric, I would describe, I was never what I would describe as the anointed ones or the privileged ones that, at some point people choose people early and they get all these jobs, right? I just did one job at a time, and I
Mhm.
just I just focused on doing my best. And from that time in 2003, 2004 through 5 deployments, next thing I come out of brigade command, and General Abrams got me the job as the 3ID chief of staff, which set me up to become a general officer. I never expected it. It's just one of those, one day you would wake up and you realize, hey, you just got selected. And the O6s that command, they're all good. You go to a very selective board, and in that board, there's so many people's files that go in there. your reputation is what matters the most. And if there's anybody that doesn't agree that you need to be a general officer, it doesn't happen that year. But I would tell you that the transition is you actually got to pause to think about it. They tell you when you're a colonel, you're now a strategic leader, where you're more up and out and focused up and out and thinking, things that are much deeper in time and space.
Mhm.
But that general officer transition, takes it to another level, where you got to kind of separate yourself from a lot of the tactical details of things, and you got to be looking at the Army's priorities, the Secretary of Defense's priorities, understand how they're all nested, um, and then you got to be able to move the organization with very little guidance. You got to be able to take intent from your boss and be able to move out, and then you got to be able to solve, I would describe as much harder problems, and then not alienate the people around you to get the work done. When you talk about leadership is tricky, to get things done, you're going to ruffle some feathers. And the question is, which set of feathers are you ruffling in your formation? Because I look at change as a constant, and that you got to continue to evolve. And there's a lot of folks that are uncomfortable with change. And so I think that as you become a general officer, is the strategic aspect, leading change on a continuous basis, right? But in there, you got to be able to coach and bring your organization along, and convince them why the change is necessary. And there's a lot of heavy lifts that you got to be able to do now.
Yeah, because one of the things I talk about when it comes to change, and a lot of people either agree or disagree, right? Depending on who I'm talking to, is like when you introduce change, you have to manage loss, right? Because it could be someone or a part of the organization that might lose prestige or stature or a process. Some might even lose a job. But yeah, to your point, I mean, change it's happening around us all of the time, and we have to adapt and we have to lead organizations through that. So early on as a GO though, like let's talk about one of your leadership challenges that you kind of had early on that you kind of had to work through, and then what did you learn from that?
I think the biggest leadership challenge as a GO, and I would say, was when I commanded Alaska. So I was, Fracta 2-star. Um, I walked into an organization that had a number of challenges, right? One is the one front and center was there was a suicide problem going on at the time. I was told that there were some disciplinary issues that existed, but I'd already commanded a brigade there, so I understood, a lot of the other dynamics that were unique to Alaska. So when you went there, all the units all wore different patches. Um, all the units in Alaska were rotating out to Iraq and Afghanistan, and people wondered why we live in Alaska if all we're going to do is rotate out to Iraq and Afghanistan. Yet we're in this environment where Alaska used to be a pretty prestigious place to live with the 6th Infantry Division, where they focused on, operating and fighting in that Arctic environment.
Right.
And so you take a combination of challenges that been underinvested for so many years. It was kind of like the lost city that, land that time forgot in many cases. It was under-resourced. There was, the sense of community was basically by the unit, not the larger organization. And then you had all these other challenges swirling around. I think the first problem I had to start with, Eric, is get the leadership to understood that what data that existed out there. Because if I asked them that laundry list of things, if those were problems that existed, they didn't recognize that they were problems or challenges. They didn't recognize if it was out of tolerance with the rest of the Army. So I had to do a big data poll, and then I would go into these sessions where I'd take company commanders, and I would take in the disparate groups, town halls in many cases, to try to understand all the issues that existed out there. And I would ask leading questions, facilitate a dialogue, because if you're going to lead change, they all got to be on board that change is needed, right?
Right.
But I would ask all these questions about suicide trends, discipline and standards issues, and everything else. And I was just shocked at the amount of denial that was there. I guess when you're in your little world and you're insulated from what are the trends outside of you, you think that this is normal. Um, but I would break it down for them. And at some point in time, they realized, okay, there actually is a problem and something needs to change. So the first part was convincing them the harder part then also is the driving the change, because the solutions, because this wasn't about a box top slide that I would present to someone. Hey, here's our narrative, and hope that what's on a piece of paper is going to deliver the change. It was like concrete investments that needed to be made across the board. It's environmental, it's holistic, right? So it tackled everything from recruiting, compensation to soldiers, investment in facilities, right? Refocusing the training environment. And so when you get them on board, then it's sometimes the people in your organization that say, too hard to do or can't be done. And what I would
Right.
always tell them is, um, you tell me what needs to be done. You tell me where the roadblocks are. My job is to knock down the roadblocks. So I spent, and that was during COVID timeframe. That 2 years there, you went from an organization, multiple different patches with a number of these different challenges to today, right? That's the Army's newest division. They all wear the same patch. There's billions of dollars being invested into place. It's one of the top places to be recruited and be a part of. But that was part of a long-term vision or strategy. So that's a long way of answering your question, right? Is convincing people that change is necessary, and then leading the naysayers, right, and showing that change is possible, right? If you're committed to it, you find the right targets that you got to knock down to deliver.
Yeah, what I love about that too is the lasting change, right? Because that prompted funding, right? Which is the resources, right? And changing the mindset, right? Putting everyone under a patch so they feel like they all belong. They're not the disparate silos of excellence, right? Yeah, so that lasting change piece too. But I like what you started with too, is like pulling the data, right? So it's coming from a place of facts, and that probably comes from your engineering mindset, right? And then, just getting that buy-in and then letting people see themselves in that change. And you're always going to have the resistors out there, right? I mean, that's what 5 to 8% of every organization that it's too hard, we can't do it. But you have those fence sitters, right? Which is like 90% of your organization. They're kind of waiting to see if there's going to be some type of, chipping away at some progress, and they jump in, right? But no, that's awesome, and thanks for sharing that, and I appreciate that because now I'm going to fast forward because I met you as a two-star. Your time at USRAF, United States Army, Europe, Africa. You were the DCG, and we went through a very, important time in history, which was the invasion of Ukraine. And yeah, so just walk me through what your mindset was, and then I'll jump in here with, kind of one of the things that you've done for me in my career. So this I mean you grew up with, I mean you were there with General Chris Cavoli, brilliant mind. I mean, understands the NATO problem set. There was a lot of prediction that this was going to happen, but when this happens, right, and you're confronted with, this massive conflict and chaos and having to like just lead the organization through that, what was going through your mind during that time frame?
Yeah, remember it started with the Afghan withdrawal, right? Out of Afghanistan. That was the first thing that hit us pretty quickly, and then quickly transitioned. Eric, I had spent 2013 to 21 in the Pacific and come over to Europe, right? So that's a big transition, right? And I had worked for General Cavoli when he was the 25th ID commander. Um, I think the biggest thing is I realized how much catch up I needed to play. I had to learn the theater as all this stuff was evolving. And I still remember as going into these updates, and General Cavoli was convinced of what they were going to do, and having been an outsider, not understanding. Um, he was right about, I would say, almost everything, right? So for me, right, it was I'd been in a theater army, right, or ASCC headquarters before I was the chief of staff of USRPAC, but this was a completely different problem, right? So the how a theater army runs is one thing, and I understood that aspect, but just trying to immerse myself in the environment, try to understand what's going on. But then, as you know, right, there was no playbook for how we approached this thing.
Right.
When you brought in, the 18th Airborne Corps and the 82nd, and it was all about, applying the lessons that we learned coming out of Afghanistan, thinking we're going to do this big potential NEO, and that whole mission set gets turned around into something completely different. And then, having spent 20 plus years doing counterinsurgency, and you hear about this transition to large scale combat operations, to actually see it happening, right, not far from where we're living, right? That is another thing to really understand, that like this is a real thing, right? The mass and momentum, right? The sheer scale, the destruction, right, is trying to reconcile all of that based off of 20 years of experience in coin, which is very different. So just but like anything else, Eric, when all this stuff hits, right, you just gotta, it's like a movement to contact, right? At that point in time, the headquarters had solid systems in place. Now it's a matter of, okay, we have a general idea what direction we got to go. Now let's go back to change management. Now we got to solve some problems, right? And we got to get the right people in the room, right? This is not time for people to be pushing back on you when you got to move the organization, and that's where you left an impact on me, because when you came in, you were prepared, right? You had a phenomenal attitude, and every time I would come back the next day, you were delivering, right? Which to me as a leader makes things easy, because you just give guidance and intent. Folks like yourself, you move out, and it's remarkable what you can get accomplished, with folks like you, right, that you're serving with. So I learned a lot from you watching you work there.
Now I appreciate that. So yeah, so this is where I'm going to jump in, right? So, um, because I tell the story all the time to folks, was you find out very quickly under pressure, right? When you have heightened levels of disequilibrium going on, all this chaos and unknowns, that you find out who leads in an organization, right? You find out who really cares to move things forward and knock down roadblocks. And what I found in dealing with you, right, was you did ask all of the right questions, and it felt like I was walking into Shark Tank every single day, right? Because you touched on it early on, right, with General Abrams, right? He wanted you to master the details. And I found out in our very first session that you had an engineering mindset, and what you were asking for was, where do you need me to knock down the bureaucracy, the red tape to get things done for our soldiers? And in our first session, you were bringing a little bit of pain to all of us, but I looked at it as a learning experience because I had never done it before. Right? What are you asking for? What is it that you expect of us? And it was very clear. You were expecting excellence, right? And you were very clear on, we're doing this for our soldiers. We got to get them the right capabilities. We need to get it to them now. And if there's someone that stands in your way, you come back and tell me, what did you do? And where do you need me? So, and I'm gonna give my counterpart, Dr. Stephen Carter, a lot of help with this, because we came back from our first session, we sat down, and we were like, oh, we're in it now. And he's going to expect us to come back tomorrow, because we met every single day at noon, with some answers. So we said, all right, look, Dr. Carter, I need you to start calling people. We need to start talking about what's the process. Where do we have, roadblocks? Where do we need the boss? Who does he need to call? And then we would come in with a book, right? I think you always saw me with my book of down to the damn screw of what everything cost, what decisions I need you to make, and then standing in my way. And I take that to this day, of how I operate, and my expectations of others is excellence, to ensure that we get the right capability in the right hands, so that we can win. Right. And I took that from our interactions of, I need to be a better professional. I need to master the details. I need to hold myself to that standard, and others around me. And if they're not there, coach and mentor, because you would take me aside, right? We would, step out of that small conference room that we would sit in, go into your office, and we'd have some dialogue. And it was, most of the time it was great dialogue. We would, very cordial and friendly, but I could always tell, like, when you were giving me a nugget of, like, you need to be better. And I appreciate that from you, from my mouth to your ears, and for the audience to know that, come prepared, master the details, and use those above you with influence for the right purpose. And not all the time, right? Because I would only maybe ask you maybe once or twice in that entire time, this is where I need you. But to come in prepared and do the work. And I appreciate that from you, to ask the right questions, to ensure that I was mastering the details, and that I would dig down deep, right? So that way I can deliver one on your vision, and then make sure that we were successful as a theater. And I carry that forward to this day. So I talk about the impact. That was the impact that you had on me in my career.
No, Eric, I appreciate that, and that's I would say those are some of the key lessons that I learned because if you're going to go up and brief a senior leader, and the question is what's stopping you from doing it. In many cases, you might think that there's a self-imposed limitation or someone put a limitation, but I would tell people too is, man, maybe some reason or another, there's a document out there that says I retained authority on something where I just can choose to delegate. The Army command policy says, the commander is responsible for everything, but the only way you're going to be successful, right, is delegating, empowering people, because that's the way we got to run. And as a general officer, what you find out really quickly, right, which, to your previous question, Eric, is that you go from something where it was very narrowly bounded and you focused on it and you were good at it. Suddenly it's a mile wide, right? And that's why you don't wear branch insignia anymore because you're a generalist,
Right.
as a general officer. And so you have to rely on the experts, right? And the thing that you bring to the table as a general officer is there's a convening authority. You can convene a meeting, and you can get people to do things. You can empower people, and then you can figure out wherever the roadblocks are and knock those down. And if I can't knock them down, then I go to my boss to get my boss to knock them down. And I think that's the there's been in many places that study problems and never accomplish anything. There's nothing more frustrating than that. And then to your point, in the end, there's someone down where the rubber meets the road that needs something, right? And then we have to figure out what do we need to do to be able to deliver that. And you and Dr. Carter, right? Maybe for you it felt like an eternity, right? In terms of the pain associated with it. What I recollect is that you guys came back really quickly, and you guys were on it. And to me, those were the ones that our engagements were the easiest ones because you guys were always squared away on top of everything. And my recollection is you guys were absolutely amazing, right? And the perfect example of folks that you want to be able to team with to solve hard problems.
No, and I would say just one thing, I don't even see it as pain, right? Because I'm one of those people that, there's plenty of people out there like me, but just being curious, right? Hey, what can we get done? Right? We've always done it this way. I'm never that type of person. I'm like, I know we can get this done. Like, let's go figure this thing out, right? And that really sparked my curiosity of one, how the army worked. How does money work in the government? Right? How does the chain of command work? And then really, who within my organization is actually exhibiting the activity of leadership? And I saw a lot of people that were part of that small syndicate because it started this wide and it got very, very narrow as time went on, right? And it was really those that, hey, we're starting to see a trend, right? It's these key people that we need to talk to get certain capability. And it narrowed things down. And you really saw the power of the government and what we can actually achieve when bullets start flying. And that made me extremely hopeful. That's really motivated me, and it's really put my leadership in overdrive because I've taken a lot of the things that you taught me just by observing you, and now I'm implementing that throughout the organization, trying to drive that change. And one, I want to say thank you for that because I don't want to leave this podcast without saying thank you for that. And I'm extremely appreciative. And yeah, for those that are listening, those out there, right? When you're presented with those hard moments, right, embrace it, right? Because there's a lot of learning to be done, even if you don't know how to do it. Because I walked into that room the first day, like, what are we doing? Right? Because I was an IT guy, right? Like, what are we doing? Right? And we were presented with the hard problem sets. But if you jump in the deep end, there's plenty of people out there that are going to help you swim. So, all right. So then you move on, right? You move on to European Command, our COCOM that's above United States Army Africa. And now you're looking at the theater as a whole, right? You're looking at all the different components. You're the chief of staff because you started as a J3,
Right.
right? And then you moved into the chief of staff. But I mean, you're looking at the full breadth of everything we have: air, ground, sea, land, doesn't matter. You're seeing it all. So what'd you learn, from those two assignments at UCOM, and what'd you take away from that?
Yeah, Eric, that's a great question. As I've mentioned to you before, I've been in a component twice. Um, when I came to the combatant command, I was shocked, right, at how much the combatant command does, right? How much authority they have to do certain things. As I started to get involved as the J3, and trying to, what General Cavoli charged me with is we got to take the combatant command that was previously primarily focused on security cooperation, which is a 5 heavy task, and you got to be able to operationalize the headquarters to transition back to a warfighting headquarters. They abrogated all those tasks and responsibilities, post Cold War, because you didn't need them, right? So organizations, you got rid of them, you moved the people around. So the biggest thing was coming back as the three, understanding what capability and authorities, what more importantly, what authorities you have. The capabilities didn't exist. So as the three was a matter of building a lot of the capabilities, so you could execute the authorities that have been given to you. But I was shocked at how much happens in the combatant command, how much authority a combatant commander actually does have, as well. So that was my big takeaway initially coming into the headquarters. So that first year was spent entirely on dialoguing with people like yourself. Just there's changes that's needed. What do you think it means to be a warfighting headquarters? And then you got to try to convince, the folks that, hey, the change is needed. It looks much different than, where we're currently operating. And then what are the tasks that we got to do to be able to make the headquarters more operational? And that became the heavy focus for that first year.
Yeah, so yeah, and then as a chief of staff, one of the things that I've been watching from afar, and and we see each other in passing, and we chat, but really driving data forward, right? So if you go all the way back to your time, in Alaska, and you fast forward to now, right? Even if you go way back, because you mentioned it earlier, right? Data has always been the key, right? And I'm going to steal this one from Dr. Carter as well, right? It's, data is the new oil, right? It's crude oil, and we got to refine it, and we got to use it, right, for something good. And so that's been your biggest push, over the last about a year and a half or so, is really pushing, taking all of this data, and then how do we operationalize it so we can make decisions, at the point of need. So let's talk a little bit about that. What do you see with data today, and then where do you think it's going?
Yeah, so that, Eric, that's the big one. It's one thing to say, hey, we got to reorganize ourselves, we got to refine our process as an organization. But that only gets you so far, right? If you want to get after what we all talk about, which is decision superiority, right? You got to be operating off of live data. And you got to figure out how to reduce the cognitive load of your staff and your headquarters. But you got to take that organizational structure and process that you built, and you got to start automating it, right? Leveraging the live data. Don't spend all this time with the Microsoft suite of warfighting tools. Get off of PowerPoint, Word, email, and everything else, right? And then operate in this environment. Sham Sanker, the CTO of Palantir, often would describe, the tools that they use, in this case, Maven Smart System, as the Iron Man suit, right? Is this idea when you put this Iron Man suit on, right? That you can see all these things, you can make better decisions. And that's what we're trying to do. There's a sea of data that existed out there. And when I started as the three and early as the chief of staff, our COP pulled in 3 data sets. That's it. Today we have 230 plus, and it grows every day. We weren't really operating off of live data. We were using outdated tools, and this idea of people forward looking and understanding what change you got to make. They were comfortable with PowerPoint, calling down to get an update on something where, that update you got is as good as the moment that you made the phone call. So where I see this going, right, is that as we operate from a day to day in a headquarters, operating off of live data, I would say that we have this thing called shared understanding, where we can now see the data, allow the analytics or the AI to work, right? To shed some of the cognitive load that you spend time doing work, you can spend more time thinking.
Mhm.
To me, the next phase of this is the only way you get to what I describe as decision superiority is you got to be able to then take all your live data that you're using and dump it into, an advanced wargaming, and modeling and sim capability that can then run the current set looking forward into the future, into a plan, or look into alternative futures going forward to provide you better insight. And I think that that's the direction. I think the potential is huge. I see what is possible, and I think at UCOM we've been driving this pretty hard. That I think combatant command wise, we're out front in terms of what we describe. It's not necessarily, we don't necessarily use the term Maven Smart System anymore because we call it the decision advantage environment, because it's everything from what you would see on a cop, right? Where everybody always uses that term single pane of glass. We have multiple panes of glass under a single stack of data that you
Right.
can leverage and see various different ways. And so I think we're moving that thing in the right direction. This has been one of the things that have been most rewarding, because for me, completely outside my comfort zone, is I had to bring in and sit down and listen to the smart folks like yourself, the young data scientist or engineer that comes in that tries to help you understand, right, how large language models work,
Right.
right, and how all these things interface, how you dig down, rip in data, bring it into a data integration layer from authoritative data sources. The whole thing, you're starting from scratch. 100%, you got to rely on the talent, right? The thing that I bring is the operational expertise. Is like it's got to be able to do this, right? And then those guys go in there and they start jamming on stuff and starting to make that thing happen. It has been absolutely fascinating to me. And then understanding like what is the potential of this, Eric? Um, we need to be all in on doing this. And so across the headquarters, right, we now take count of how many PowerPoint briefings, how many Excel spreadsheets that we've killed, how much less email you got to do, because I think that all of this can be dumped into this system and you can do your work in there. Our boards, bureaus, cells, and working groups, um, all moving towards being automated now and getting off of those products that people spend an inordinate amount of time preparing.
Now, thanks for sharing that too, and it's refreshing to hear, even at the senior leader level, that we're understanding data, and we're using that in our on our everyday leadership, decision making process. Because one of the things that I've told folks, I used to be a knowledge management, right? That used to be my, calling. And it was starting at the structured data layer and being able to apply metadata and use, automation. Back then it was, SharePoint and workflows, but now it's Power Automate and Power BI and, the Maven Smart Systems of the world and, IBM, Watson and all these other capabilities that are out there. Microsoft Copilot, which is now a thing, right? That helps us make the routine, that help us in our everyday progress and workload. But I would say for leaders out there is one, understand your organization and how people work, because that's critical to what data is relevant and what needs to be captured and what needs to be thrown away, right? Because not all data is good data. But being able to take in that data, invest in the tools, invest in the people, and use people to be the intellectual horsepower behind that strategic agility you need to make decisions. And I think the tools will help us do that. And I just want to say one, thanks for sharing. And so we're coming to a close, and I want to say thank you for taking the time, to share your story with us. Starting with your family and sharing that intimate story with me. I really appreciate it. I don't take it for granted. And sharing your history. So hopefully there's a lieutenant, a major, or a aspiring colonel out there, even a young general officer out there that's listening and can see themselves in your story. And there's a young leader out there that's saying, man, I'm going to take some risk. I'm going to go try to foster some change and have that change like you had in Alaska. And then, for those folks like me that are curious, right, and you see that senior leader, don't be afraid to walk up to them and ask them questions. Because, I was probably that, kind of weird person, like, man, what does he want from me? I'm always asking questions like, what do you see in that? What do you actually mean by that? What do you need? And, taking that all in. And I want to say thank you again for investing in me and taking the time with me, being patient with me as I learned, right? And seeing that glimmer of curiosity in my eye, and really investing in me and allowing me to grow, during that tough time, because I did in fact grow through that tough time. So um, I do this with everyone that comes on, right? So this is how we close all of our episodes. If there's a young aspiring leader out there, what's that one nugget that you would leave with them, from a leadership perspective, for them to chew on it and grow from?
Yeah, that's a great one. So there's this saying that we don't really live life to the fullest. We live the life that we focus on, right? And look, throughout my career, Eric, I've carried enough doubt. When you go to West Point, there is a lot of talented people there. Um, in looking back, what I try to tell people right now is anything is possible. If you have a good work ethic, you have someone that's willing to invest in you, the sky is the limit, right? Do not limit yourself, right? And I led with the saying because if you think about it, if all you focus on, right, are all the things that you don't have, right, or you do this comparison thing where, hey, that person's better than me at this or that, you're you're going to live the life that you focus on as opposed to the life, right, that the potential life that you do have out there. So what I tell people is you got to broaden the aperture. Doubt, internal doubt that people have, I think everybody has it, right? It's a matter of managing that, setting more lofty goals and knowing that anything is possible. You just got to choose every day to make the decision that's moving you towards that. So I would say is don't limit yourself, right? Live to your full potential. There are plenty of people willing to help you get there, and the opportunities are there. And Eric, as I started and talked about, hey, the challenges with retiring and what am I going to be outside the uniform, but just hearing you talk makes it every bit of it worth it. You asked the question, and I apologize for going on a little bit longer. You asked the question about a company commander, about the mistake that you made.
Hmm.
Um, I was bringing my resignation into my brigade commander to my OER counseling, and I had it in a folder as he was doing my, back when they'd actually have to sit down and you'd have to sign your evaluation in front of them. And he made it dramatic about the block check and everything else, but he told me a story about the kind of guys that he takes care of and gives them a top block and the highest enumeration. And the story was, I was talking to the soldier when you guys were deploying. I did no notice deployment. And I asked him, hey, what is it? And this is the brigade commander talking to the soldier about, hey, what can I do for you? And I still remember this kid's name is Specialist Richie. I wasn't there. This is recounted by the brigade commander. He said, hey, sir, I don't need anything from you. I got Captain Andrysiak. Um, so we went through the drama of the block check and signing the thing. I never, I never pulled that folder out of my pocket, right? I realized at that point in time, I was thinking more of me and not necessarily the impact, right, that I was having on people. And that's the other piece of this, that why this becomes so important and why it's worth it, why I believe in it so much, right? And that's why, to your comments, Eric, thanks for everything. You're a great friend. And I look forward to seeing all the trails that you will blaze, you and Dr. Carter going forward, because you're the future and you're the leaders that we need. All right. And I know that you're investing in people like you've been invested in. So I sorry about going long on that one, but I just want to make sure that you knew that. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, no reason to apologize. And thanks to Richie for that comment, right? Because that probably set you on a different trajectory, right? And I'm glad you didn't pull that out of your pocket, right? Yeah, one, thanks again for coming on, sharing your story with us. I wish you all the best in retirement. We'll stay in touch, of course. But for those out there that, if you have any questions, comments, for Pete Andrysiak, Major General retired, please, shoot them to me at eric@leadershipistricky.com, ERICK@leadershipistricky.com, or go to leadershipistricky.com and just leave a note in the chat, like we normally do. Or if you're on YouTube now, first hit subscribe and then leave a comment, and we'll make sure that those get answered directly to you. For those that are tuning in for the first time, I want to thank you for tuning into Leadership is Tricky. And for our repeat listeners, I want to say thank you again. And before I get off, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the shield right behind me that was made by Sergio Creations. It's made of complete wood. He does all kinds of things in his hobby shop now, but I asked for it. He sent it. It's extremely heavy. I've tried to mount it a few times, but Sergio Creations, you can find him on Instagram. Check out his work. I want to say thank you to him. But yeah, so sir, thanks again, and we're signing off here.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.